Welcome. I'm Elise Lieberman, the director of the Toby Center for Jewish Life and Learning here in Warsaw. We're delighted to see so many of you, especially those who started with us last week, and so many new faces as well. For those of you who are new to our program, we extend a warm welcome and hope that we will see you here each month. This evening's conversation between Professor Dariusz Stola and our author Konstanty Gebert will take approximately 45 minutes, and it will be followed by a Q&A session. As usual, we invite you to put a comment, but preferably a question, in the chat box, and we will do our best to field some of those questions. So I think we're here to not just resume, but take off with the conversation. And I am delighted to hand the mic over to Professor Stola. Dariusz.
Thank you very much. And I'm really glad to see so many people listening to Konstanty and me this evening after rather unsuccessful start last week. There are good reasons to listen. The book which has appeared last year in Polish, The Final Solutions, about the génocidaires, as the French call them, the genocidal killers, and the effect of their work. The author is very well known in Poland for a variety of reasons. He has written and spoken many times on Polish Jewish past and present, on Near East, but he has also a personal experience with the history presented in this book, namely, he's been a number of times in Yugoslavia or former Yugoslavia in the early 1990s during the war and the mass crimes committed there, especially with Tadeusz Mazowiecki, who at that time was the official United Nations representative dealing with that matter, who resigned symbolically. So this book is not only extensive, more than 600 pages of small print. It's comprehensive and it's insightful. And there are other reasons to read it. If you don't read Polish yet, nobody's perfect. It may take you some time, and I hope there will be a translation. So I'm not going to make any resume of this book. It would be impossible. I'm only going to say that it presents several cases of genocide that fits with the definition of the United Nations Convention against the Genocides, the definition which was designed by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer, who, in response to the killing of his family and most of the Polish Jews during the Second World War, but he started thinking about this new kind of crime already before the Second World War. He thought about other terms, and only in the early post-Second World War period he developed this new idea, more specific idea, which is now in the definition of the international legal definition of the genocide, and the new name to describe this new kind of crime. And Konstanty shows that there is a history longer than the Second World War to the story, going back to the early 20th century, and related to the colonial history, the imperial history, and specifically to the German colonial history in Africa. And possibly there has been no end yet to this history. We are actually facing, and I can speak in the present continuous, facing a series of mass crimes committed against a minority in communist China, the Uyghurs, which meets at least some of the requirements of the United Nations definition, but let me leave it to the author. Let me start with the basic question, because I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about what the genocide specifically is and how does it differ from so many mass massacres that we know from history, including the biblical history. Mass killing of the inhabitants of the towns taken over after siege, mass destruction, ethnic cleansing, and so on. What's the difference between the genocide and the old good massacre?
This, of course, depends on the definition you want to adopt. As you said, I'm using Lemkin's definition, the way it was formulated in the UN Convention, not because I think it is ideal, but because this is the only definition that has behind it the full power of international law. And we had people actually sentenced on the basis of that definition. But in historical discourse, we've got over 50 different definitions of genocide. So the answer to your question, obviously, will depend on which definition you adopt. If we stay on the grounds of the Lemkin definition, its crucial sentence says that genocide is acts committed with the intent to exterminate in part or in whole a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. The word intent is crucial. Genocide is not just killing a lot of people. It is a project whose goal is to remove a group of people from the face of the earth. It is not about looting them. It's not about enslaving them. It's not about exploiting them. It is about having them gone. And in any criminal trial, as any lawyer will tell you, proving intent is always the most difficult thing, because you really have to go into the head of the criminal and prove, usually against his protestations, what his genuine intent was. And using that definition, only a number of mass crimes can be considered genocides. And since intent is fundamental, they're all related to a vision of a better future that will be achieved once the goal is implemented. And this too is crucial for my understanding of genocide. Mass murder is committed by people who like to kill, like to torture, like to rape, like to loot, and sadly, many of us do. Genocide has nothing to do with the satisfaction of urges of this kind. The genocidaires I spoke to in Rwanda didn't like what they were doing, but they were inspired by the lofty vision of a better Rwanda once all the Tutsis will be dead. This is the vision that inspired the Nazis. This is the vision that Pol Pot had in mind when he started exterminating his fellow Cambodians. Ultimately, it is a moral vision. The world after genocide will be better. So even though we take no pleasure, the genocidaire would say, in the act of genocide, we draw moral satisfaction from our contribution to a better world.
So you believe that some people believe that killing masses of other people is a moral duty? Duty to whom? To what?
Well, this depends on the worldview that enables and indeed encourages genocide. It is a duty to a better world, but that better world needs to be better for the group that you think deserves it. For the Nazis, it was very clear that better world should be better for the Germans and other Aryans. The rest of us could go to hell, and almost did. For the Interahamwe in Rwanda, the world will be better for the Hutu once they're rid of the Tutsis. For Stalin and the Bolsheviks, the world will be better once there no longer will be Ukrainian kulaks sabotaging the revolution. For General Lothar von Trotta, commander of German colonial troops in what was then German Southwest Africa and today is called Namibia, the world will be better without the Herero and the Nama, who are impeding the glorious progress of German colonization. All of them had a vision of a world which would be better, not necessarily for everybody, but for the people who deserve it. And in order for that world to be better, people who do not deserve to live should be eliminated.
So in fact, you imply here a kind of a perverse version of progress, that the genocidaires believe that they can bring a better world, that there is a progress, a perverse idea of progress, and they can bring it out.
Well, yes, because I think that we can call the genocide the bastard child of enlightenment. Before enlightenment, nobody had the idea that government has an obligation to improve the lot of the people it is governing, right? Governments were thugs whom people paid to protect them from even worse thugs. But nobody expected a medieval lord to take care of sanitation, education, public health. This was the new idea that Enlightenment brought forward. And it was a wonderful idea that we owe the possibility of having this conversation to the Enlightenment. We wouldn't have modern medicine, education, human rights. I mean, the whole package. We owe it to the Enlightenment. But there is a glitch in the Enlightenment project. Because what are you supposed to do if some people stand in the way of the better world that we are trying to build and refuse to change, refuse to be socialized, refuse to step aside by their very existence, endangering this glorious project that we want to bring to fruition? Eventually, well, there's simply no other way than getting rid of them for the greater common good. So yes, this is a vision of progress, which is pathological, perverted, but stems from the same roots that the glorious Enlightenment project stems. And I think it's important to note that, because we often say, learning of a genocide, that this is barbarian, this is medieval, this is a throwback to ancient times. And through those words, we refuse to accept responsibility for what this really is, an intrinsic part of the modern project. The ancients didn't commit genocide. If you read about massacres which routinely would take place when an army would finally, say, conquer a besieged city, the descriptions are horrible. Be it Carthage, be it Baghdad at the hands of the Mongols, be it Constantinople at the hands of the Turks, be it mutual slaughter between different sects of Christians during the religious wars in Europe. But those massacres usually last a couple of days. I haven't found any description of any massacre that would take longer than a week. Because, I mean, how much can you murder and torture and rape and loot and kill? I mean, there can't be too much of a good thing. Eventually, you get tired. And if somebody survives, then let them live, who cares? The genocidaire thinks in the exactly opposite way. Anybody surviving is a fundamental threat to the project. This is why, say, the Germans in occupied Poland could send the detachment of soldiers to the forest because there was a rumor that there are 2 Jewish kids hiding there. This is radically different from what barbarians would do. This is a modern, thorough state.
I'm pretty sure that Zygmunt Bauman, another Polish Jewish thinker, would have agreed that genocide is a modern project. In his great book about Holocaust and modernity, he referred to the modern conditions for committing a genocide. I think you went a step farther in thinking about the intentions, not only the way of doing it, but also the intention of doing it being very modern. And here we come to the Holocaust, to the Shoah, to Zagłada, as we call it in Polish. I understand that although you refrain from analyzing this particular genocide in depth, you mention the behavior of the killers, you quote extensively the speech in Poznań, which explains the morality of the SS officers committing mass crimes in Eastern Europe. But here we touch a problem which is sensitive and controversial, namely the comparability of the Shoah to other mass killings. Could you please comment about it? Can we compare the Holocaust to something else?
Mm-hmm. First, thank you for mentioning Bauman. I stand on the backs of giants, Lemkin and Bauman. Bauman put forward his very radical theory of the Shoah as an example of modernity and was raked over hot coals for it. And I simply think he wasn't radical enough. It is not only the Shoah, genocide itself conforms to Bauman's model. And this we know from Lemkin's definition, which can be applied universally to other genocides. But this, of course, raises the question you have raised. Can the Shoah be compared? And we know the radical position that, say, Elie Wiesel took. Said, no, it is unique. It is, as Cohen said, the tremendum. It cannot be comprehended. It cannot be compared. Comparing it is a travesty at best, if not actually an insult to the memory of the victims. I think he was wrong. Now, it's a horrible thing for me to say. I mean, whom am I to tell Wiesel or his shadows that he was wrong? But I think he was wrong for two separate reasons. One is there's simply too much in common between what happened in the Shoah and the Poraimos, which was the genocide of the Roma and Sinti, which took place at the same time, and the earlier genocide of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, and the later genocide of the Tutsi at the hands of the Hutu extremists in Rwanda. The similarities are just too flagrant to ignore. But more importantly, I think we cannot afford not to compare for two fundamental reasons. One is, in order to try to understand, we need to compare. Science is built on comparison. If we say that something is incomparable, we say it is beyond the reach of human analytical thought. In a world which continues to have genocides, we cannot afford this luxury. We need to understand in order to be able to prevent. But even more importantly, if we say this is beyond our capacity of analysis and reflection, we relegate all those involved, perpetrators and victims together, to a separate moral universe. We cannot analyze, we cannot judge, we reject them. I don't think we have that right. So here, I'm with Yehuda Bauer, who also started off by saying that the Shoah is unique, and then changed his mind and said it is unprecedented. Before the Shoah, there was nothing quite like it, But he says, since it happened, this is proof enough that it can happen again. And therefore, yes, we can compare.
Well, I understand that to say that something is incomparable, you must first compare it. And a more modest version of it is to say that something is fundamentally different. And indeed, there are some aspects of the Shoah that make it different from the genocide of the Armenians or the Tutsi or the Herero people. Could you please specify what are these features that make the Shoah different from any other genocide?
Well, first of all, there is a concentration of evil action and evil intent in the Shoah, which seldom was seen in the cases of other massacres. Maybe because this crime was committed by a highly educated and highly industrialized nation. And therefore, it could be delegated to specialists. Not more than 20,000 people were involved in the actual events of the Shoah. Also, the victims were not in any way a threat to the killers. And finally, it happened in the very heart of civilized Europe, which likes to think of itself as, well, better than those places out there where they do those horrible things. So yes, there are differences, important differences. And just as it is important to compare, it is also important to remember the differences, which is why almost every genocide has its own separate proper name. We say the Shoah, or as you quote it in Polish, zagłada. The poraimos, the devouring in the Roma language, is a separate term for a separate event, even if it happened at the same time. The Armenians speak of the Medievan, the Great Destruction. The Tutsi speak of the Genocide, but they spell it with a J instead of a G as the first letter, which makes it also separate. I think this is important. It is almost as if we were speaking about different individuals. Now, individuals can have the same experience, but they will experience that same experience differently. All of us have been in love, but I wouldn't want to tell anybody that his love was just identical to another. So we need to remember the specificity as we compare. And there is an added danger in treating the Shoah as it were, the model for genocide, as if it was the model of the meter, which is conserved in Sèvres, and other measures are measured against it. It does not have to be a Shoah to be a genocide. Genocides can differ, and we need to respect their specificity.
Well, I see that you require us, or at least people whose job is to think and distinguish between events, to give names, as in the Garden of Eden, man gave name to all the animals. is to give a name to each of these individual cases of the genocide. And let me add an aspect which struck me. I remember when I saw for the first time a facsimile of the protocol of the Wannsee conference in January 1942, which was a meeting of coordinating meeting, speaking about the logistics of the pan-European killing of each and every Jew. And there was a long list of countries from Norway to Greece under German domination, but not only. Also Great Britain was on the list, which was outside of Hitler's reach at that time, but they had in mind that was a part of the plan that in the due time they will make it. But from the Nazi perspective, the general government Germans had established in occupied Poland was a colony and a periphery of a civilized world. So this is, I think it fits within this story of making genocides at the margins of the civilized world. And the Lublin district, where most of the killing took place under Odilo Globocny, kind of an ideal, perfect Nazi, completely devoted Nazi killer, was the periphery of the Hitler's dominated Europe. Maybe a German land in the future, but that time it was a dumping ground for the Jews.
Well, yes, but I would not assume causality. That is, I don't think that the Germans murdered the Jews in Poland because it was the periphery of civilized Europe. They murdered the Jews in Poland because that's where the Jews were. This is what you do when you have an industrial project. You build your factories where your raw materials are. And if your project is the industrial murder of millions, it makes much better sense to put the factories where the millions already are than to invest into additional transportation to transfer them from where they are to where they will be killed. So no, I actually don't think that Poland's periphery was the reason why the Germans chose us as their killing ground.
But that also made Shoah different from the previous cases of genocide. That means in case of Shoah, victims were shipped across Europe to Treblinka and Auschwitz and other locations in German-occupied Poland. While during the Armenian genocides, the victims were marched across Turkey. In German West Africa, the victims were marched into the desert. But there is always a kind of mobility related, and there is the logistics of the genocide. And I think you covered it quite extensively. Could you please add a little bit more about this logistical aspect, the mobility involved in the genocide?
Societies commit genocide according to their level of socioeconomic development. And the two best examples at the two extremities of the scale would be Germany and Rwanda. Germany, as we had said, highly industrialized, highly educated society that conducted its genocide as an industrial project, right? They built factories for it. They employed specialists who could run those factories. And then the problem simply was conveying those who are to be murdered to the killing institutions. Rwanda was and remains an agricultural society. And there, you couldn't do it using the intensive model that Germany had used for murdering Jews and Roma. You use the extensive model, which is applicable to agriculture, which is why in Rwanda, you had hundreds of thousands of perpetrators, because the killers had to go to where the victims were and slaughter them physically with machetes. Incidentally, it always struck me that no eyebrow was raised when the government of Rwanda suddenly imported 500,000 machetes, okay? Produced by a very reliable British company from the best British steel. Nobody was surprised that out of the blue, they suddenly need 500,000 machetes. Those machetes were used for the slaughter. One of the genocidaires I spoke to told me that just how difficult it was. He told me, you see, the human being is a big animal, and it takes time and effort to slaughter it. And that obviously limited the effectiveness of the genocide, although this was compensated by the number of perpetrators. If you look at the killing rates of Rwanda, they go beyond the killing rates of the German gas chambers because so many people were involved in the killing. Turkey is somewhere in between and slightly different. The telegraph played a crucial role with the Turkish government, the Young Turks in Istanbul, communicating with the special organization, which was this military structure they had clandestinely set up to perform the murder. They communicated with them by telegraph. But it wouldn't be possible to have industrial murder in Turkey during World War I. And no, they couldn't import 500,000 British machetes. So they essentially marched people to death. And those who survived were left to die of starvation and thirst in the Syrian desert around Deir el-Zor, which was a name of a town that came up recently during the Syrian civil war. But what is probably important to note, there was also a vast bureaucratic endeavor behind the Turkish genocide of the Armenians. Instructions were sent to the administrative authorities of the towns and villages from which the Armenians had been deported to allocate their property, their houses, their fields to Turkish war refugees. It was clear that those people who allegedly were being transferred elsewhere for their protection are not coming back. Interestingly enough, there was a project which was never fully implemented of deporting Greeks from the Aegean coast. Turkey expected Greece to immediately join the war against it. But there, it was very clear that this is going to be a temporary translocation, and very strict instructions were given about preserving the property of those Greeks who will be deported because they are coming back. So you really cannot have a genocide without extensive and creative planning, and also without the capacity to improvise. In World War II, Germany could produce an industrial genocide. In the first genocide of the century, the genocide of the Herero and the Nama in what is now Namibia, General Lothar von Trotha simply expelled them into the desert and then fenced the desert in. Some 30,000 people died of starvation, of thirst, before they could die of starvation. But interestingly enough, in the diary that the good general kept, there's a sentence which really expresses what the genocidaires have in mind. He wrote after yet another clash with Herero and Nama insurgents who were simply not taking kindly to the fact that Germans were coming in and settling their pastures and converting them into fields. He wrote, I have determined that this nation needs to cease to exist.
You stress that it doesn't take to kill a lot of people. Not every mass killing is a genocide, but how small can be a genocide? You have been in Yugoslavia, you have visited Srebrenica, and you have written extensively about it. Can you have a micro-genocide?
A genocide is a genocide. It is not determined by the number of victims. If you have a group which qualifies as one of the groups identified in the Lemkin definition that is national, ethnic, racial, religious, and that group is, say, 10,000 strong, and you murder 5,000 of them because you didn't have the time to murder them all, but this is what you wanted to do, this will constitute genocide. Intent decides. Actually, the question you've raised was also raised during the first genocide trial in Europe since World War II, when General Stanislav Krstić was the head of the logistics of the Drina Corps, the Bosnian Serb army's unit responsible for organizing the act of genocide in Srebrenica, was very offended with the accusation. He said it's all lies and American falsehoods and whatever. But then he said, okay, but let's assume, for the sake of the discussion, that we really did kill those 7,800 people, as the prosecution maintains. 7,800. Is that genocide? To which Judge Theodore Miron, who was the chairman of the court, answered, and just how many would have satisfied you, General? And Krstić abandoned this particular line of defense.
I think that we have returned to the distinction between the Shoah and other genocides, and your warning not to make the Holocaust a standard for the genocide because it makes the bar very high. And we don't need to see gas chambers. We don't need to see a pan-continental plan to kill each and every member of the group to have a genocide. How does it work in China today?
This is a fascinating question from the legal but also political perspective. The Lemkin definition, after listing the fundamental characteristic of intent and enumerating which groups qualify to be victims of genocide, which in itself raises a number of very important questions, Lemkin initially wanted to include on that list also social and political groups. The Soviet Union objected. This is the UN 1948. The Soviets had very good reasons to object. Had this definition been maintained, they would be accused of genocide. And since it was important to have a unanimous support for the convention, the list of the groups that can be victims of genocide was shortened. Social and political groups were excluded, which created the problem when the Khmer Rouge were prosecuted. They murdered 2.4 million people out of social and political reasons. This clearly was not genocide under the UN Convention. But then it was discovered that they also murdered 40,000 Cambodian Muslims for being Muslims. And this crime made it possible to accuse the Khmer Rouge of genocide. But back to the definition, it then lists the criminal acts that, if committed in the intent of exterminating in part or in whole one of those groups, those acts constitute genocide. And one of those acts is the transfer of children from the group being persecuted to the perpetrators group. This is one of the things that China is doing to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Children are being removed from their families, transferred to Chinese families or to Chinese boarding schools in order to Sinicize them, to convert them into non-Uyghurs. And this technically meets the requirement of the UN definition. This is, of course, a far cry from Treblinka or from the 500,000 machetes. The point is, the intent is the same. A group needs to cease to exist. And maybe the Chinese are simply producing a more advanced genocide, if you wish, a more humanitarian genocide. We don't kill you. We just convert you into something else.
Speaking about the kidnapped children, we have heard many stories of thousands of Ukrainian children transferred into Russian interior. Do you see it as a case of a genocidal behavior too?
Potentially, yes. There's a raging discussion about whether Russia's crimes in Ukraine can be considered genocide. I think that there are no reasons to think so. Russia is committing crimes of war and crimes against humanity, but I do not see the intent to exterminate the Ukrainians as a national group, which is fundamental to the definition, with one question mark: the fate of those children. Russia argues that these are orphans or lost children that are being transferred outside the combat zone into safety, but if the possibility will exist, they will be eventually released back to their parents or families or next of kin. I do not know. But if Russia intends to Russify them, then yes, just like what the Chinese are doing in Xinjiang, this is sufficient to apply the designation of genocide. This simply needs to be researched more.
So let me ask you a final question, and let me ask you in Russian. Что делать? If genocides have happened, which means we have not erected sufficient mechanisms to prevent them, what we can do?
Well, first of all, to recognize what you have recognized, that the slogan of never again that has been repeated like a mantra over and over is just that, a slogan. The American journalist David Reef, who also did work in Bosnia in the 90s, in his book on Bosnia, Slaughterhouse, has this extraordinary sentence in which he says that after Sarajevo, after Srebrenica, we know exactly what never again means. It means that never again shall Germans kill Jews in World War II. That's all it means. There have been genocides after Treblinka. So the first thing is to know that, to be aware. The second thing is to appreciate just how easy it is to commit genocide. The preconditions might be difficult. You need to have total control. A democratic society cannot commit genocide, not necessarily because it's more moral, but because it clearly is not organized enough. But if you have total control over media and over education, then if you want to commit genocide, it's doable. A lady in Berlin who, as a young girl, survived the Nazis by hiding in German families, a Jewish lady, Irene Reiskron, told me that a cousin of hers in the 30s, who was employed as an official in a German office, being a pedantic German official, always at noon took a lunch break and then sat on a bench in the park and fed the birds. And eventually, benches were segregated in that park. And the bench he always sat on did not have the Nur für Juden wording for Jews only, which would allow him to sit there. But that was the bench he had sat on for 20 years. He probably didn't even notice. So he sat and started feeding the birds. And the sweet old lady was passing by who knew him from the office and therefore knew that he's Jewish. And she said, "Oh, sir, but you're mistaken. This is not your bench. Your bench is over there." She probably didn't have one evil bone in her body. She pointed out this misdemeanor the way that she would have pointed out if he was littering. She would have said, "Oh, you dropped something." If somebody would have told her that she had set the trains to Treblinka in motion, she'd be very surprised. And then if what the sentence means was explained to her, outraged. In 1935, nobody, the Nazis themselves included, had any idea of trains to Treblinka. But those trains were possible because German society decided to cooperate with a law that was immoral from the very beginning and therefore illegitimate and therefore illegal and wrong. I had this honor of knowing Polish righteous Gentiles, the Poles who were recognized for saving Jews during World War II. And they tried to establish a kind of general model of what made them different. They were a small minority. Why did they engage in this extraordinary, heroic activity? And no socioeconomic criteria worked. No, this wasn't education. You could have university professors and illiterate peasants. It wasn't religiosity. You could have fanatic Catholics, militant atheists, and everything in between. It wasn't politics. They were left to right and everything in between again. The one thing that set them apart is they were unable to convince even themselves that this is none of their business. If they saw evil, they were forced to react, regardless of everything else they saw. And one of them had some time drinking vodka, and then he said, "Look, I'll tell you because you're a good man, you won't get it the wrong way. I didn't even like those Jews." And they said, "Oh, but please don't tell anybody because they call me anti-Semitic and whatever." But this is exactly the point. It's not about liking victims and therefore helping those we like, which means if we don't like somebody, well, we don't help them. It is about the belief that the world is our business. And the practical consequence is we need to educate our children to be disobedient, not to respect the rules about benches. Now, I know how silly this sounds. I have 4 children, and I know that children don't need any encouragement to be disobedient, right? They're beautifully disobedient on their own. But this is a slightly different kind of disobedience. It's a disobedience that empowers you to do the right thing, even if everybody else is not, even if it seems hopeless and helpless, and even if you don't see the possibility that evil will be eventually defeated. You still do the right thing because it's your business. And if we manage to educate our children like that, we'll have a better chance next time around.
Thank you very much. I see that we have a number of questions popping up in the chat. Should I now give floor to Khaliz?
So first of all, Kostek and Dariusz, thank you for this provocative, I don't know, the word is, it's not stimulating, but you've really put some things out there for all of us in a way to better understand, to define, because we all need some kind of definition, because we can't just sort of have this amorphous thing. And you've already provoked many questions and comments, but I don't want to detract from the way you summed up this part of the conversation in terms of what is our responsibility, wherever we are, whoever we are, whether we like them and who them is, to engage in education, in social action, in being on the front lines to do good. How do we take it from here?
Very simple. There are so many early warning signals. One of them is dehumanization. If people are compared to animals, to vermin, this is a red flashing light, because you can't have a genocide without that. For some reason, people are okay with killing animals and less okay with killing people. So if we want to kill people, we have to convince others that these are really animals, not people. There's some very sweet genocidaire had beers with in Rwanda, told me, you know how we call them, the Tutsis he meant? Inyenzi, cockroaches. You think it just by accident, just happened? Think of it. Would you like to live with cockroaches in your house? See? I also have the right not to want cockroaches in mine. This is the same line of reasoning that Adolf Hitler used in Mein Kampf when he raged against German emotional anti-Semitism, which he said is a misunderstanding and a waste of time. Anti-Semitism should be scientific. It is, he says, like the doctor who is treating a tuberculosis patient. He doesn't hate the bacillum that causes tuberculosis. He simply stands on the side of the superior life form, which is the human being, against an inferior life form, which is the bacillium. And in the same way, we need to exterminate the Jews because they're inferior and they're toxic. We need to protect the superior life form, which is the Aryan human being. So when in public, we hear someone say that a group of people, whatever that group is vermin, is bacillium, is venom, this should provoke immediate condemnation, because you can't have genocide without it. It's as simple as that. Now, mercifully, in the overwhelming majority of cases, it doesn't end with genocide, right? But this is of no relevance, just like if somebody stands on a flyover over a highway and throws stones at cars, most stones will miss, right? That doesn't exonerate that person. And words can be stones and words can kill.
One of the questions, Kostek and Dariusz, that came up is using the word genocide, the term genocide, in an inappropriate way, going back to the comparisons perhaps, or how people perceive it. What kind of reaction, when it's misused, I'm sorry to use that term misuse, but when it's misused, it's as distressing and perhaps as dangerous as when it's used.
Well, this is why I'm compulsive about definitions. And this is why I spend number of pages in my book explaining what the definition is and what it means. Because genocide means something. it isn't just a synonym of awful. Just recently, a Russian newspaper published a letter by a local functionary in a small town who complained that the residents, through their criticism and their complaints, are committing a genocide of Russian functionaries. Now, what he wanted to say is, I'm fed up with their complaints. But he used a word that he knows carries a great emotional load and which is routinely misused. Just as we have this rule about the argumentum ad Hitlerum, right? When eventually in every debate, somebody will call the opponents Nazis. And this means you cannot have any meaningful exchange of opinions anymore. In every conflict, eventually somebody will accuse their opponents of genocide. This is not only sloppy thinking. This is not only an abandonment of the intellectual rigor that people engaging in debate are obliged to observe. It's threatening because it reduces the meaning of the word. If everything can be genocide, then nothing is genocide. And whatever happened to the Jews or to the Tutsis isn't any worse than me having a bad day.
Dariusz, would you like to add a final comment before we close?
Well, what you said at the end of answering to my question, "Što dělat," what to do, sounded very much like Marian Turski, our great friend and Auschwitz survivor, call "Don't be indifferent," the 11th commandment, which is don't be indifferent even to minor ill signs of something horrible coming. And yes, in most cases, these are stupid and bad, but not fatal, not deadly acts, but they may become deadly after some time. And it reminds me about, I don't remember who said, oppose evil when it's weak.
Okay.
So let me end with this call.
Thank you.
Kostek, Dariusz, thank you very, very much. Kostek, thank you for bringing us this book. Dariusz, thank you for helping us get through some of the most important parts of the book so that we can continue the conversation. But as you both said, it doesn't end with a conversation. It ends with, or continues with, doing the right thing, not being indifferent. So thank you both very much. Thank all of you for joining us this evening. We will be sending out information about the next call, and perhaps our guests will share some resources or further reading for you. If you have further questions, please don't hesitate to contact the Toby Center. And I invite you to join us at the end of February, on February 26th, for an exploration of Chassidut, of Hasidism. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.